visiting professor of the University of Gdańsk, Professor Steen Österling, who is full professor in urban sociology and member of the Center for Research on Environmental and Social Change, and of the board of the Antwerp Urban Studies Institute. He's scientific director of the Hannah Arendt Institute for Diversity, Urbanity and Citizenship. His research is connected with local social innovation and welfare state restructuring, the political sociology of urban development, urban renewal and community building, new forms of solidarity in diversity, urban diversity policies, civil society dynamics and the relationships between cities and states. This is a fragment, quotation directly from my application to the visiting professorship program at the University of Gdańsk. I have met Professor Steen Österling, hello, in our common project in which he is coordinator, called Solidarity in Diversity. This project is also described in this application form, so I can make it more common for us. Professor Österling is the project coordinator of this Marie Curie International Training Network on Place and Practice-Based Solidarities in Diversity. The network brings together 10 universities from around Europe to train 15 doctoral researchers in theories, methods, research ethics, and science valorizations on solidarity in diversity. They do this together with 23 non-academic partners who provide secondment positions, training, and feedback on the training program. So I have really a great pleasure to introduce to you a person who is like an expert in the field of not only sociology, not only urban studies. He's an expert in the field of these soft ways of community building, soft ways in which solidarity is a value and also a platform of making this work fruitful. So please feel free to ask your questions concerning not only the issues present in Steen's lectures, but also the questions about what is important for you under umbrella of solidarity built as a not only value but also practice, everyday practice. So the floor is yours, Steen. It's my pleasure to give the mic for you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Maria and the University of Gdańsk to invite me here. I've been doing, as Maria said, a lot of research on the notion of solidarity, especially in very diverse contexts, and it's a real honor for me to be able to present my work here in Gdańsk. Gdańsk, who has, as you know, a very special history with the concept of solidarity. It's the birthplace of Solidarnosc and the European Center, or European Solidarity Center, so it's a real pleasure for me to be able to present my research on solidarities across culture differences here. So what we started our research from and what I'm going to present is not just my own work. It's work of a number of consortia that I have been able to coordinate around solidarity work. And so there's a lot of different people involved, amongst which Maria Mendel, but also many other colleagues, which are too much to name. So this is not just my own individual work. And the basic problem statement from which we started is that the term solidarity is used a lot. So there's a lot also in the academic world, but also in the public debate, there's a lot of references to the word solidarity. It's mentioned all across the board, and even more, it's increasingly mentioned. If you look at especially the sociology, the term solidarity is, for the past few years, more mentioned than before. However, if you look at definitions of solidarity, if you look at people who try to define and describe what solidarity is, there is a lot of disagreement, and there's actually there's not that many people who really try to really define it. They use a term, they kind of assume that everybody knows what other people are talking about, but if you start defining it, you have a lot of different definitions which do not always agree with each other. So, for example, when we went to the European Solidarity Center a couple of days ago, the way they define solidarity seems to be the kind of joint struggle against an authoritarian state. That's how they define solidarity. If I would go to many of my colleagues in my own department, people who study welfare states, who study social policy, they would not recognize that definition of solidarity as a definition of solidarity. They would say, no, solidarity is about the redistribution of resources in a system of social protection. And depending on who you talk to, you have a very different definition of solidarity. And so that is basically where we started our research. There was a lot of talk about solidarity. Many people mention the word solidarity, but it's heavily contested if it comes to its definition. There are many different definitions. Moreover, and that's where the Solidi project, the European project which Maria was referring to, the notion of solidarity is also increasingly captured in Europe by radical right forces, extreme right forces, populist extreme right politicians. And that's quite a recent phenomenon. And so what is interesting is that solidarity for a long time has been opposed to neoliberalization. Solidarity was the value which was positioned against market-based restructuring. That was the way solidarity was positioned. We now find ourselves in a position that amongst those people using solidarity, there are people using the term solidarity in very different ways. And so if you look at right-wing discourses, radical right-wing discourse on solidarity, they do not reject solidarity per se. They do not say solidarity is a bad thing, which was the case with neoliberal political forces. They would reject the notion of solidarity altogether. However, we now are contending with a political force that does use the word solidarity, but in very different ways. Because when they say we want solidarity, they say we want solidarity, but it should be restricted to our own group, to our own people. And own people here is defined in racialized or ethnic culture terms. So they would say, for example, and there's a whole debate in social policy, for example, on welfare chauvinism, saying we have to maintain our welfare states, but in order to do so, we need to keep migrants out because they will undermine our system of solidarity. So solidarity is not rejected, but it's restricted and it's defined in racialized, in ethnic terms. If you look at social science, you see a similar kind of skepticism about the degree to which solidarity can be combined with ethnic and culturally diverse societies. So, for example, if you look at the work of Robert Putnam, who doesn't use the word solidarity but uses social capital, which is a very similar term, he came to the conclusion, maybe against his own will, in the late 2000s, that solidarity or social capital and diversity do not go well together. So he found out on the neighborhood level that very diverse neighborhoods actually have less social capital, have more difficulties maintaining solidarity. And you have a lot of other authors, Ruud Koopmans, a very known German sociologist who is very skeptical about the degree to which solidarity and diversity can be combined. You have work like Will Kimlicka, a multicultural scholar, and they all say, sometimes against their own will, that their research shows that ethnic and cultural diversity and solidarity do not go well together. So it's not just in the public debate that the relation between solidarity and diversity is contested, it's also in scientific debates. From yet another angle, post-colonial scholars are also criticizing the idea of solidarity. Especially the fact that solidarity is supposed to be a kind of enlightenment value, enlightenment concept, and they criticize the notion of solidarity for having universal pretensions, for being presented as a kind of universal notions, although, that's what they argue, it very often has very Eurocentric connotations, and Bambra is one of the people that have been sort of making this argument. And what they argue is, if you look at how solidarity has been practiced, has been institutionalized in many European countries, in fact, from the very beginning of the institutionalization, of the organization of solidarity in our societies, and the welfare state is the prime example of that, the national welfare regimes as the kind of institutional expression of how you organize solidarity in modern societies. From the very beginning, the colonized subjects were excluded from it. So if you look at the case of Belgium, which is the country where I work, Belgium was, up until the 1960s, a colonial empire. It had Congo. It's one country, but it's a huge country. The Congolese were never included in the welfare state. Although all the resources that Belgium stole and robbed from Congo and brought to Belgium were important for creating a wealthy society, for a developed society, but the colonized subjects were never included. There was never any talk that the Congolese would be part of that welfare system that they were constructed. So from the very beginning, the way solidarity has been institutionalized in the 20th century in many European countries actually excluded the colonialized subjects, and hence was de facto racialized. It was only for white people. And therefore, post-colonial scholars say the way people like Ruud Koopmans or Wil Kimlicka describe migration, the migration flows that we have seen the last couple of decades in many European countries, the way they describe this as a danger, as a threat to our systems of solidarity is Eurocentric. Because this is not an external disruption to our welfare system, it was built in from the beginning. And what migration does is just to make that exclusion visible. It's not a disruption of an existing solidarity, it's making visible that some people have from the very beginning already been excluded from that. So you can only call it a disruption, and this is the case in many social policy studies, that migration is seen as a kind of threat undermining welfare systems. You can only call it a disruption if you ignore the whole history, the whole racialized history of how welfare states and how nations have been constructed in Europe. Moreover, they also criticize the notion of diversity because they say it assumes that ethnic and cultural differences just exist, or natural, or given. They say no, they have been constructed. There is a history to these differences. There's a reason why Italians, for example, are nowadays not seen in my country as foreigners. We even had a president or prime minister in the mid-2010s was actually someone from Italian descent. He was never really seen as a migrant. He was seen as, he's just from here. That was not the case in the 1960s when his family came to Belgium. So these kind of differences, they change over time. And so we have to not just assume that we know what these ethnic culture differences are. They're not just a given, no, they develop over time, and we need to understand that history. The same can be said about Ukraine. For many people in Western Europe, they probably 10 years ago would never have been taught about Ukraine, just not thought about it because it's quite far away. And then because of what's been happening there, the attacks by Russia, suddenly all people talk about Ukraine as a part of Europe. I am not saying that is not true. I'm just saying this is constructed. 10 years ago, people wouldn't think about it, at least in Western Europe. It's probably our ignorance. We don't know much about these countries, which for us are physically quite distant. But nowadays, because of the events, we kind of reconstruct these differences and say, well, they're actually part of Europe. So what post-colonial scholar says, you cannot assume differences. Some differences matter more than others, and they have to do with construction processes in which power and racism and so on play an important difference. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that solidarity is not an easy notion, and that solidarity and the link with diversity is quite contested. And a lot of people, both academics but also in the public debate, are quite skeptical about the degree to which they are combinable, the degree to which you can have solidarity in groups and populations that are ethnically and racially diverse. And so that is a problem. We started off from Belgium. In the city where I live, the city where I work, in Antwerp, more than 50% of the people have a migration background. In Brussels, one of the other cities in which we work, 80% of the people have a migration background. If you cannot organize solidarity across culture difference, then these cities cannot function. In the whole of Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking region in Belgium where I work, 1 in 4 has a migration background. If you cannot organize solidarity across cultural differences, then the society cannot operate anymore. You need to be able to have solidarity which transcends ethnic and cultural differences. So what we were trying to do in these multiple research projects is trying to rethink the notion of solidarity for societies which are increasingly diverse. And our intuition was that this was possible. That's also what we saw when we were talking about a lot of organizations who were working in urban context, but that it meant we had to rethink the notion of solidarity. That something in that notion and the way we have been developing it in the 20th century, also the way we've been organizing it, had to be rethought. And we took great inspiration from the work of a Polish sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, who wrote this very beautiful essay. I think it's one of the most important and most suggestive essays written about the notion of solidarity in the past couple of decades, where he says the word solidarity, it's in multiple ways, that word is seeking for flesh. It's patiently looking for flesh which it could become, and it won't stop seeking eagerly and passionately until it succeeds. And of course, that's what happened in Gdansk. I mean, the whole history of Solidarność is a history of a word, solidarity. It's trying to become concrete, to become meaningful in very contextually specific and meaningful ways. And so we thought, we need to go on the same quest. We need to go on the same search for what solidarity could mean in our super diverse cities in Europe. In order for us not to exclude specific understandings, we start off with a very broad understanding of solidarity, which perhaps is not broad enough to encompass everything, but we thought solidarity must be about the sharing of resources. It doesn't need to be money, it doesn't need to be financial resources, very often it is, but it needs to be sharing something. If you're sharing something, then you're in solidarity with something. And sharing something can be a lot of things. It could be sharing a place, it could be sharing financial resources, it could be sharing a disagreement with each other, it could be sharing a conflict. So you need to share something. That is the notion, that is for us the essence of solidarity. And that sharing happens because people feel they have a kind of membership of a similar group, that they have something in common, that they are part of something similar, that they have a kind of loyalty to each other. If you don't feel and that is something you can disagree with, but if you don't think you have something in common, then why would you bother with each other? Why would you even be interested? Then you would be probably indifferent to each other. So we feel it's about the sharing of resources out of a feeling that you belong to a similar group, or at least that you have loyalty to a group. So we started our quest by going back to sociology. That's a particular disciplinary choice, of course, but we felt that solidarity is really core to the discipline of sociology. If you look at the very early sociologists, they all write extensively about the notion of solidarity. So we felt we had to go back to the classics. That's a pretty Eurocentric thing, because most of the classics are European, at least as they are recognized. There are probably others as well. But we also felt we had to deconstruct them. We had to look at them from a historical perspective to find out what their biases and what their flaws were in the way they writing about solidarity. And the notion then, and the idea was then to reconstruct the notion of solidarity on the basis of case study research. And we have, by now we have conducted probably 50 to 60 case studies together with organizations who are doing that in the field, who are constructing solidarity in the field, to find out a different notion of solidarity. This was our attempt to summarize sociology on one slide. It's probably overly ambitious and perhaps a bit simplistic. But this is what we felt we could learn from sociology. Basically, we said in sociology, there are probably more, and there are probably more in other disciplines, but we felt there are at least 4 different sources of solidarity, 4 different four different understandings of where solidarity comes from. Again, this is a very selective and perhaps very Eurocentric attempt to understand, but this was our starting point. The first is, and that you can easily recognize from the work of Emile Durkheim, French sociologist, and he basically said solidarity in modern society comes from a division of labor. Close to modernity is the idea that we all have our own task, our own specialization, and we are in solidarity with each other because we know that we need others to go about our life. While I'm lecturing, somebody else is baking bread, and so when I'm done lecturing, I can buy a bread for the family, and we have something to eat. In the meantime, somebody else is looking after my children, and so on. So we have a division of labor. Everybody is doing one task, or two or maybe three tasks, and for the rest of the tasks that we need to be able to go about our life, we can rely on others. Which means this division of labor allows everybody to specialize, to differentiate, to pursue our own interest, and we recognize this have collective benefits. In order for this to be able to happen, we need to be in solidarity with the others that we need during our life. We cannot be self-subsistent farmers, we rely on others. So that's interdependence. We are in solidarity because we recognize, we are aware that we need others to go about our life, and that this has collective benefits. Say the social insurance system, the core of the welfare state, is really a system of interdependence. We contribute when we're working, and when you're too young to work, because you're studying, because you're a child. When you're too old to work, when you're a pensioner, you can draw from that system that you have contributed to earlier. Secondly, after a while, Durkheim came to the conclusion that the division of labor was not sufficient, and that there needed to be something, a kind of shared culture framework, a kind of moral integration into some kind of community to support solidarity. That's basically, that's the sort of communitarian or nationalist version of solidarity. You need to have a kind of, you need to be, to have an idea that you share a culture framework, that you share norms and values, that you're part of a similar society, that you're morally integrated into society to be able to be in solidarity. Of course, nation formation, which is a very dominant process of organizing our political system over the past centuries, is an example of that. We are in solidarity with other people from our own national group, whether they be Polish or French or German or American. So that's the second sort of solidarity. The third form of solidarity is going back to Marx and Weber, is struggle. We have a shared enemy. We have a shared thing we are in opposition to, and by fighting the same struggle, we nurture solidarities amongst each other. You could say Solidarność, that's what they did. They had a shared enemy, an authoritarian state, and by fighting together, by having the same enemy, by going to the same fights and struggles and defining and opposing the enemy, you create solidarity amongst each other. Of course, that excludes the enemy. That excludes the group you're in opposition with, but the labor class movement has been very, and other types of social movements have been very effective in creating solidarity amongst their own movement members by fighting the same enemy. These three sources of solidarity are all pretty structural. They're really into the structures of society. The fourth form of solidarity is perhaps more familiar to American sociology, and it's really the kind of micro-level encounter between people. You can see that in the very early urban sociology in the early 20th century, but also in the work of George Simmel, a German sociologist that moved to the US. And they believed very strongly that solidarity came about on the micro level. When people interacted with each other, when strangers met each other in public space, they created a kind of informal social contact, and from that informal social contact, very light forms of solidarity emerged. He called it association. Today we would call it conviviality, or other sort of light forms of solidarity. Now, I could go on forever, but the main point here is that we think that these four sources of solidarity are still valid today, that you can still see them if you try to observe why is there solidarity in particular places, in particular occasions. You can still observe that. However, we need to kind of historically deconstruct how these sources of solidarity have been used. And our main point here is that solidarity, as a notion, is a kind of modern response to the conditions of industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism that unevenly unfolded across the world, led to a lot of social problems because people were derooted from their previous socioeconomic conditions, mostly being peasants. They were kind of moving to the city where they were involved in wage labor, and they were not very well socially protected, they were exploited, and so on. And the response to that, to the very adverse consequences of industrial capitalism, was to offer social protection and to develop the notion of solidarity as a kind of response to the bad social conditions of industrial capitalism. That happened initially locally. You have lots of experiment with social insurance system, with local strikes, with local health mutuals, with local housing corporations, and so on. So there were lots of local responses to the bad circumstance in industrial capitalism. But across time, most of these local responses have been nationalized. Not nationalized in the sense of moved into collective ownership, but nationalized in the sense that they were organized on the national level. And so what happened is that the development of systems of social protection, welfare regimes, was caught up with the parallel development of creating nation states, creating nations, political nations, and these two developments, welfare state and nation state development, actually got intertwined in such a way that solidarity systems were nationalized. And we are so used to that we think that is evident, but we should not forget, of course, that the labor class movement was supposed to be an international movement, internationalist movement. If you see the first works of Karl Marx and so on, the way they organize it, we need an international movement because capitalism is international. So the response must also be international. However, over the course of the 20th century, for a number of reasons which I'm not going into, the response actually was a national response. We built national states that then protected their citizens in different ways against the adverse consequences of capitalist labor markets. So we have national social insurance systems, which clearly draw on the notion of interdependence, but these national systems were the result of national struggles. National labor unions, national trade unions got involved in bargaining and negotiations with national governments to create national systems of social protections. And these interdependencies, these struggles, which were the source of solidarity in our modern times, were actually integrated within a national framework. So we looked at national labor markets, although we know that our economy is involved in international division of labor. You cannot understand the Polish economy if you don't look at what the position of the Polish economy is in the world economy. We have national labor movements and welfare regimes, although we know that the struggles are international, that these labor unions are often up against the same multinational companies who make decisions on a worldwide level and not on a national level. And that's important, because it means, what it basically means is that we have made the development and the institutions of solidarity dependent on the idea of cultural homogenization. So although there isn't any necessary link between solidarity and diversity, the way we have learned to be in solidarity, the way we have institutionalized systems of solidarity has been completely intertwined and caught up with nation-state formation, and hence we have learned to be in solidarity with people of the same nation, meaning the same culture background, the same culture framework, the same shared framework of norms and values. And so that's the way in which solidarity has been completely predicated on culture homogenization, on ethnicized and racialized forms of nation building. And so, although there is nothing in the word solidarity that makes it rely on culture homogenization, it has become that way because of the way we have organized our solidarity systems in the 20th century. And they also draw on historical continuity because they're learning processes, they're educational processes. In school, we learn people about the group they belong to. We have civic learning. We train people in national histories. And that's very clear why that is not self-evident. In Belgium, people are taught about, let's say like in other countries, we learn about the Second World War. It's a world war. Yet if we talk and we teach our students about the World War, we talk very national stories. It's about Belgian soldiers. We never talk about Moroccan soldiers. We never talk about parts of the World War which took part far away from where we are. We tell them national stories about what was essentially a world war. So we nationalize our histories. When we train new generations of human beings, of children, we learn them to think in particular ways, and we learn them how to belong to a particular nation. So we socialize them again and again in the same notion of you're part of this political nation in which you share culture a lot with these people, and that's your basic primary political group. And of course, when people are part or member of that group, we give them access to solidarity. So that's why citizenship is kind of legal status. You're a member of a particular national state, you've been trained and learned and civically indicated in that national tradition, and that gives you access to certain sources of, to certain solidarities. It gives you social rights. Now, why do I make this whole historical narrative? Well, because that historical construction of the notion of solidarity is now being problematized, is now being challenged, because solidarity is organized within the boundaries of a territorial national state, and is based on people living from generation to generation in the same country. So it's spatially bounded, it's territorial, but it's also based on historical continuity, people staying in the same place from generation to generation and being trained to be a member of the community over there. That, of course, is being undermined by migration, because the people that migrate actually interrupt that intergenerational transfer of culture framework. If people from Congo move to Belgium, we have a little bit of a shared history. Of course, they will have experienced it very differently, having been colonized and being subject to all kinds of violence. But also, people move from Afghanistan and Syria to Belgium, or to any other country. We cannot assume that there is continuity there. People come with very different culture frameworks. So the intergenerational transfer of culture frameworks from generation to generation, which is an important source, at least as the way it's organized in the 20th century of solidarity, that actually is disrupted, doesn't work any longer. Moreover, the idea that there is interdependence is also problematized, because when we talk about socio-economic integration, you look at the numbers, the number of people with a migration background in unemployment statistics is much higher. The people who are low-skilled and contributing less to the social security system, the people with a migration background are overrepresented in there. So people start doubting whether there really is an interdependence here, whether they're really interdependent with these new groups of workers. Moreover, the social struggles have become much more complex. It's not just a socio-economic struggle for redistribution anymore. You also have all kinds of culture struggles. Struggles that have to do with racism, the recognition of people's cultural identities, and so on. So a struggle doesn't function as easily anymore as before as a kind of generator of solidarity. So all this makes us look for alternative forms of solidarity. We can still use these sources, but the national framework in which we have been developing this has become more problematic. One of the answers, and that's the answer of the political right, was culture assimilation. It's impossible, they say, to organize solidarity in diversity. So the only way in which you can do so is by reducing the cultural diversity and letting people be assimilated in their new societies. So they don't believe in solidarity and diversity, they say it's not possible. We don't think this is a good answer. If we look at our cities, we're beyond that. In Brussels, where you have 80% people with a migration background, there is no cultural majority left. So how would you organize, integrate these people, and what would you integrate them? Moreover, most European societies are heavily secularized or individualized, and so the idea that we all share the same idea about what society is actually misguided. There are lots of disagreements amongst Belgians and French and Polish and so on. So the idea that there is some clear society in which you can integrate is perhaps a bit of an utopia. Maybe it's not even utopia, maybe it's a dystopia, but it's an illusion. So the idea of culture assimilation is really a dead-end street, we think. Then you had the answer of Robert Putnam, who was the social capital scholar, who said, well, perhaps it doesn't work today, but we've been here before. And he refers to the American history and the melting pot history. He says, well, you know, we were all migrants, which is not entirely, it is not entirely true. I mean, if you have to give a post-colonial critique of Putnam, he ignores the First Nation people, of course, who had to be erased before they could build a new nation. But if you put that aside, he says, well, we were all migrants, many European migrants, also migrants, formerly enslaved people from Africa, and we built a nation together. So we, the Americans, we are actually a novel one which has been constructed out of a diverse many. And Putnam says we can do that again. We can again go to the long and painful process of recognizing our differences and creating a new we, a new common ground. And that would be more inclusive, and it would have the potential of undoing maybe perhaps some of the racialization, although if you look at current US politics, we're not really there yet. So it could be more inclusive, it could be also undoing racialization, but it's still predicated on the idea that you need a long history together before you can be in solidarity. It basically means you need several generations of people talking across their differences, and then in the end they might find themselves forming one group slowly by intermarriage, by having, by being involved in education together and so on. And so it could work, but maybe only on the long term. And the question then becomes, as people who live today, what can we do in the short and the medium term? We cannot wait for the long term. What can we do in the medium term? And that's where we came to our alternative reading of solidarity, which is a reading that is not just invented by academics behind their desk, but is also came into being by working together, by doing research together, but a lot of civil society associations in our own countries, in our own cities. We basically said the classical sources of solidarity remain relevant. However, the spatial and temporal framework in which we nurture solidarity has to be adapted. And the reasons to think that, because also in the academic literature, as well as in practice, you see people moving away from the idea that the way to integrate people into a group is by giving them formal membership. That remains important, but in the citizenship literature, for example in political science, there's a lot of talk of citizenship not being just a legal status, political membership, but also being a practice, being something that people do. Let me give one example that really inspired us. In 2015, there was the horrible war in Syria. It's not just a war, it's basically the Syrian president, who's now been removed, who basically attacked his own people. So there was a big wave of migrants from Syria to Europe. And the state couldn't deal with it. The Belgian state has legally obliged to give them a bed, to give them bread, something to eat, and to give them a bath, to wash themselves. And the Belgian state said, there are too many of them. We can't solve this. There's too many of them. We need more time to set up these structures. And while they were doing so, while it took them months to organize infrastructures to give a bed, bread, and a bath to these refugees, just next to the Minister of Interior Affairs, where all these people are queuing up to get access to the system, in the park next to it, citizens set up an informal park to house these people, to give them food, and to give them a place to wash. And the car group of these people organizing that informal encampment in Brussels were 6 undocumented migrants from Morocco. 6 people who have no formal membership of the Belgian state actually succeeded in feeding up to 600, 700 undocumented migrants a day. The way they did so is because they went to the food market in south of Brussels at noon, collecting all the leftovers of the vegetables and the food that wasn't sold, collected them, hired a van to transport it to the informal camp, and prepared food on a mobile kitchen. They were able to pull that off in 2 or 3 days. They did that for several months. And so what this shows you is that actually these people, without having formal membership of the Belgian state, actually behaved like citizens. They took responsibility for the needs of others. They organized food support, they organized a camp for these refugees. And so there's lots of these practices in cities. And so we will not deny that it's important to have formal membership to get access to solidarity, but what this shows is that in what people do, there's a lot of citizenship. And if even people who are not recognized as formal members of a political community can actually behave as citizens, taking responsibility for the needs of others. So this made us say, well, we need to move away. If we want to understand solidarity and diversity, we should focus less on formal membership and more on how people practice citizenship in their everyday life circumstances. So we need to make a temporal shift from a formal status to a practice, to something that people do now, in the present moment. Secondly, we need to make a spatial shift, and this spatial shift is based on a lot of literature in the field of human geography. We need to move away from the idea that solidarity is contained within a territorial state and look at what people do in the places in which they live. Now, territory is a sort of bounded area. It's a national state, these are territories. Places are where people are in proximity to each other. And where people are in proximity, different dynamics emerge. And so what we see is that where people are in proximity, even if they have not chosen to live with these other people, they just find themselves together. And in these circumstances, you see, not always, not everywhere, but in some cases, you see that people take joint responsibility for the places that they inhabit together and start doing things together. Not out of grand visions, not out of grand ideologies, but just because they happen to find themselves together, because their children play in the same playground, because their children are in the same school, because they are in the same factory floor together. Sometimes they don't even like the other group, but they share time in these places together, and therefore they engage in kind of solidarity. And so here again, we move away from territory to place. And so what that means is that we have a notion of solidarity here, which does not replace welfare state solidarities, which remain very, very important for many people's well-being in life. But you find an alternative form of solidarity which is nurtured in particular places in the here, in the particular place in the here, and at particular times in the now. And that's how we came to a notion of solidarity, which is solidarity is what is done in the here and the now. It's done in particular places, in the particular times. And just to finish off, because I recognize I've been talking already for a long time, so I'll just try to... Sorry? It's okay. So, as I said, we have a lot of different examples and cases. But let me give a few other ones. It's not on the whiteboard, but it's one we discussed at noon. In the city where I live in Ghent, which is a sort of medium-sized city, around 250,000 inhabitants, it's big in Belgium, but it's the third biggest city in Belgium, but of course it's not that big in Poland. We have a big, since 40, 50 years, we have a big in-stream of Turkish migrants. And these Turkish, Ghent used to be a textile town, so there was a lot of textile industry. It was one of the first cities on the continent to industrialize. We stole the textile machines. We sent spies to England, to Manchester, and we took the machines, photos of the machines, and we took them back and we reconstructed them. So it's a city with a big textile industry. The textile industry was no longer competitive in the 1970s and 80s. And in the last decades of the textile industries in that town, it attracted a lot of Turkish migrants who would work at very low wages to keep that textile industry competitive. And so lots of Turkish migrants came to the city to work in these textiles industries, but then the industries closed down anyway because we could no longer compete with Asia and with Turkey. And so what you have is poor industrial neighborhoods where you have an old, white, working class people who were frustrated about the fact that the textile industries closed down. They feel nostalgic about the grand past, which is no longer there. And moreover, they're confronted with inflows of big migrant communities, Turkish migrant communities, which they feel are very different people. They have a different religion, they don't have the same history, they come here and we don't really know how to talk with them. And so a lot of conflicts between these two groups. They don't find themselves in the same place, they visit the same shops, they have to share the same public space, but they don't like each other. They feel a lot of, especially the white population, feels quite angry with these migrants because they feel they are the reason for their decline, which is not really the case. And so we went looking in these kind of neighborhoods to look for projects in which there was some kind of solidarity across differences. And in one of these neighborhoods, we find a project of social workers that said, okay, these people don't have a lot in common. The white population feels quite left alone, left behind. They feel they're impoverished, and then they're confronted with people they don't know, and they feel they are benefiting from the system more than they do. What can we do to build some kind of solidarity there? And they did a few projects, and they were looking for, okay, these people share the same place. Can we find some commonality there? And one of the projects was from a social artistic organization, which is a culture organization that doesn't, let's say, are less concerned about aesthetics and are more concerned about the social aims they can reach to their art. They're funded by the government. And they said, look, what is very interesting here is that these Turkish migrants actually come from the countryside. And they have a tradition of home weaving. They weave at home. So especially the women have a lot of knowledge about textiles. These retired Belgian workers have worked their whole life in textile factories. Why don't we bring them together to do textile work together in their free time, of course, not for a factory. And by doing so, by putting them next to each other, they will discover that in fact they do have commonalities. They both have knowledge about textiles, different knowledge of course, but they have. And so what they did is they just organized weaving workshops together, and people would, even though they wouldn't speak the same language, would start exchanging techniques, would find pleasure in doing weaving work together. And in fact they said, although this new group looks like a disruption of what was going on here, there is a commonality here. We both have an interest in textile, and from doing textile work together, we can actually reinvent the image of the neighborhood. They did the same with using disused factory floors, because there's lots of brownfields there, like the shipyards here in Gdansk. Most of the time very polluted grounds, so it takes a long time for this to be redeveloped by real estate developers. And they started organizing urban agriculture on that. So they used the concrete factory floor under which the pollution was based. They set up big boxes, and they started cultivating plants there. And what they realized is that, again, these two groups who wouldn't talk to each other both had an interest in gardening. And in fact, these Turkish people, because they came from the countryside, actually had a lot of knowledge about how to garden, how to grow plants, which then they could exchange with this established Belgian population. So again, they took this factory floor, which was empty in the same neighborhood, started doing things together, and in doing these things together, in the moment, even though they didn't have these big debates about whether Islam was compatible with Christianity or with secularism, but they did things together. And by doing these things together, they actually found out that they do have something in common, that if they took joint responsibility for the disused factory floors and did things together, that in fact they could actually create forms of solidarity that easily crosses culture boundaries. So these are just two examples, and maybe just to finish off, to give a little bit more of a critical example, because I don't want to sort of present these place and practice-based forms of solidarity as the kind of solution to everything. It does have its problems. I'll give you an example of a factory floor. So we had a researcher here who spent a few weeks working in a mail order company. It's a mail order company in the periphery of Brussels. It's a very diverse factory floor. There are around 70 different nationalities working in that mail order company. And it's tough work. It's tough work, it's not very well paid. It's fast work, because every morning they get boxes of mail orders who come to the airport, and by the evening they have to put all the mail orders in different boxes to be sent off to their final destination. So lots of people working there, many of them are low skilled or are not very well, are not paid very well, work in very sort of stressful circumstances. But what we found out here is that on that factory floor, there were actually very strong forms of solidarity. If somebody was not feeling very well, other people would work harder at the moving assembly line to kind of make sure that the other person could keep up with the work. If there were new people coming into on the work floor, they would help these people to get accustomed to the job, to learn all the tricks. They would cover for each other when somebody has to go to a toilet. They were only allowed one toilet break in 4 hours, and so there would be a lot of small forms of solidarity in which it didn't really matter what the culture background of that other person was. They would be really in solidarity. So what we analyzed was that because that there was actually a lot of solidarity there, and we were asking people, why is it possible? Why do you do this? Why do you engage in small acts of solidarity all of the time with your fellow workers, even though you don't know them, even though they are from very different culture background, and so on? And the answer came every time the same answer came. They say, in the evening, all of the mail must be out. So our task is in the morning, there's boxes of mail orders, and we have to get them out in the evening. Because if we don't get them out in the evening, we have to work until the work is finished. And what that actually meant is that they said we are dependent on each other. If we don't work together, if we don't help newcomers, if we don't cover for each other, then we actually all suffer from it because we have to work until the work is done. So this very strong awareness of cultural independence, of this very strong awareness of that interdependency in the context of a time pressure of the neoliberal economy and a culture of efficiency actually led to very strong forms of solidarity, forms of collegiality, you could call them. Of course, this has its problems, because what we found out is that these acts of solidarity were only there on the factory floor. Of course, if you would go to the company, you would see that there's a factory floor, but there are also offices. Offices where the administrative personnel works. And if you look who was working in the administration, people were more highly skilled and they were also all white. If you then looked at how people would, how they would interact, there would be almost no interaction between the people in the administration and the people on the factory floor. They would actually also enter the building through different gates. So they wouldn't meet each other. And the only person who would go between these two parts of the company was the factory owner, the company owner, who had a door in his office. He could go immediately into the factory floor where the mail order was being collected and redistributed. So what that meant is that if you have strong forms of segregation, then it actually undermines place-based solidarity. So you have to be very attentive to these forms of spatial segregation. And if you want this place-based solidarities to be more inclusive, you have to actively work against these forms of spatial segregation. Also, it was very hard to the trade unions to organize solidarity between these two categories. So the people on the factory floor would be very much in solidarity with each other. They would feel they have a common struggle. But the people in the offices didn't see a lot of solidarity with the other ones, except for one group. There was one place, I'll ask you the question, there's one place where some of them met. There's one moment and one place in which the factory workers on the floor and the people from the administration met. You think about a place? Sorry? Toilets. They had separate toilets. Could have been the toilets. Sorry? Smokers. The smokers. So there was a smoking corner, and there was only one smoking corner. So in the smoking corner, people from the administration and the factory floor met, at least those that smoked. And so what that showed is that that the cigarette becomes an object of solidarity because those people had interaction across different worker categories. But what I'm trying to say here is that also, if you look at place-based form of solidarity, it has some inbuilt problems as well. It's not the solution to everything. And one of the inbuilt problems is, of course, spatial segregation, but also the fact that if it's happening on a factory floor, then it also creates divisions between different categories of workers. And it's really hard from that particular place alone to overcome divisions between different types of workers. Okay, I'll finish here, and I'm very curious to hear your questions and remarks, and maybe criticism.
Thank you very, very much. And first of all, I have to express my biggest impression, which is an admiration about the structure of your lecture. From contesting solidarity via rethinking sources, nationalization, to alternative forms of solidarity represented in the cases. Thank you so much, Steen. It was very interesting and inspiring lecture. And now the floor will be open for discussion, but please let me add something which is very important in the aspects of organizational issues. So this event is organized by the Center of Students and Doctoral Students Activism, so to say. So thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for your preparation of this meeting. So we will both, Piotr Patalas and me, we will moderate discussion part of this meeting. So floor is yours now. Go ahead, Dr. Piotr Kowzan. There is another mic. Okay.
Dziękuję. Hello, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting and it was very good food for thought. I was really curious how you will bridge the gap between the notion of solidarity and the exact phenomena that are behind that we can name solidarity. And I'm not quite convinced by the idea of sharing resources, maybe because I'm suspicious because of the language, probably. In Polish, sharing and dividing is the same word. So it means like, yeah, that's the source of my suspicion. And later on, when you described the examples, I found that, or maybe it's my impression, that it's really a very sociological view on solidarity, because you focused on the identity, belonging, and still resources and the capitalist structure of the society. Whereas I'm from the Institute of Pedagogy, and in pedagogy we think a little bit differently about things because we do not only describe, but we are trying to answer the question how to build solidarity. And I find that in your presentation something is missing, because I can, for example, listen in solidarity, and then there are no resources. And when I do something because of the solidarity, then probably the reciprocity is missing. I mean, the reciprocity is kind of delayed. For example, I do something in solidarity, and then I expect you not to say thank you to me, but to do the same for others. So it's more like an obligation or cascading obligation. And when we introduce something like that to the idea of the solidarity, then we could see that some of the examples of the solidarity could be some sort of dead ends of the solidarity. For example, I can deliver food for migrants because I was fed before, but I can expect from the people that I deliver the food, I can expect from them to say thank you. Whereas and then the solidarity, the chain of the solidarity is kind of, it's the end. But whereas when I ask them to do the same for others, then it's kind of, it's a new history of the solidarity. That's my comment for you. Thank you.
So, thank you for a wonderful lecture. It was very inspiring. Of course, I think, the best place to talk about solidarity. Thank you so much. My question is kind of demanding, but I would say, start question, is space enough for solidarity? Because examples you mentioned, for me, I think in order to get, it's very, I think, practical example. We have a space, we meet together, but I think it's not enough to have space. We meet together, but we need to have something in the space. So my question would be, what should occur in that space, according to you? Of course, I have my own answer to that. You know the theory of radical needs by Agnes Heller. She's a Marxist philosopher. She develops the idea of Karl Marx, but it's a very classical one, but I think it fits perfectly for our times. So maybe we'll discuss that later. It's kind of my interpretation, but I want to pose the question. What should occur in the space? So is the space enough to produce solidarity and to introduce solidarity? So that's just a basic question. Maybe let's start from it. Thank you.
Okay, very inspiring. I'm a cultural geographer. I'm from a different wing, from different institute, and I really like when you kind of ended up with what I would call cultural geography, precisely. So maybe a few comments. First, there's one thing which I kind of missed, which is inequality. Can we have solidarity without inequalities? So if you're all equal, like, do I have to experience, show? Is it necessary, or inequality is inscribed into solidarity? So there was kind of thing that came first to my mind when you started to speak, inequality or certain kind of injustice. So solidarity as the answer of injustice. I was wondering, like, you know, can I show solidarity with you, for example? I'm not really sure. I mean, like, okay, when you spoke longer as a lecturer, of course, I have solidarity because I know it's not easy to end a lecture in time. But in what sense I can share solidarity with Maya, for example, or how important it is in kind of normal daily basis. So this is the kind of the roots of solidarity, because we mostly spoke about this. And then it was a kind of solidarity with strangers, because, like, I think you mentioned this, but on the other hand, if it's a total stranger, why should I care? So we need to have a bond, probably, at least some. And I like when you came eventually, I was waiting for this, to the place, because that could be the best example. And contrary to one of the colleagues who asked how to build solidarity, I mean, I don't believe in building solidarity. I think it's learning. So how we can learn, and there's examples you give. There are very good examples, place-based examples, very cultural, geographical, and cultural geography, kind of new cultural geography, which is geography of meanings and senses in places. And I think I had to want something more. I think it was just today, The Economist published a very nice article about adulting. They have courses on adulting, so how to become an adult, and maybe learning solidarity. It should be part of the courses, like one-day courses. That's we have to kind of learn, but probably first we have to kind of share something, so not become a stranger, so a certain bond or something that unites us, because I don't really think I can be solidar with a total stranger. I have nothing, I know nothing, and I hardly care. If we have something that we share, so then we can kind of start to learn and become a kind of adults. And my actual question is solidarity and social media. The social truth, which is a popular it's emerging social media platform owned by Donald Trump Incorporated. I want to make you. I mean, I want to hear your comment about this, you know, social media and solidarity, because there was quite a lot of this. Sorry, it's too long. Thank you.
Some of them were articulated by not pedagogues, but they were very, very educational, as you have heard. Thank you so much, Mariusz. This is a geographer. Yeah.
Yeah, I will try to do justice to the many questions you've asked, and thank you for being so generous with your comments. It's of course, solidarity is a daunting topic. There's so much to learn and to know about it that's impossible for one person or even a group of persons to all encapsulate it. Maybe the first question was on how to bridge the notion of solidarity with the exact phenomenon. It's really difficult to say, because when I spoke about all these case studies, people didn't always say this is solidarity. We said, we think what these people are saying, this is what we understand as solidarity. So we interpret, which is what I think that's what we all do as scientists. We see things in reality and we say, this is solidarity because it resembles things in very different circumstances. So we abstract from very particular practices and particular context, and we give it a common name. And that's, I mean, I think that's a necessity, but it's also problematic, because we don't always know whether people would recognize the similarities that we see. It's a trick that we do as scientists, and it can become problematic if we group a number of things together that people say, we don't actually think that what's happening here with us is the same as what's happening there in that other place. However, we felt we could do so because when we were doing this research, especially the first project, we had an advisory group of around 50 associations, including all the associations that we did research with, and we presented our results always to them. And so we had sort of conversation backward and forward saying that we think this is solidarity. And so they all the time talked back and said, I'm not sure that what's happening here on the factory floor is the same as we see in the youth welfare organization, is the same as we see in this public space. So we had a lot of conversations, and in the end, most organizations, not all of them, but most organizations felt it was useful to group these very different empirical phenomena under the same heading of solidarity, because they felt they were going against the mainstream, which had this very idea of solidarity as you practice amongst people with a similar culture background. They felt they were doing something that was going against the mainstream, and that for them it was helpful for these different empirical phenomena to be grouped under the same term, solidarity and diversity, because it empowered them to defend what they were doing. So they felt we articulated something that they also experienced and practiced. And so one of the indicators of our success, which we also used with our funding body, is saying, in the next round of applications for subsidies, but also in parliamentary debates, the phrase came back over and over again. So the organization we worked with adopted the phrase because they felt it was helpful to say, it's not just we who are doing that. There's a number of organizations in different fields that are doing this, that are doing something similar, focusing on place, focusing on the practices. And because we are not alone, they felt empowered. They felt it legitimizes what they were doing. So there is a trick involved in interpreting and sort of sticking the label solidarity on there, but we didn't just do it from our kind of ivory tower in the academia. We really did it in interaction with these organizations, which does not mean at all that everybody would agree. There were probably in every case would be people who say, I would like to call this care, or I would like to call this conviviality. So we are not saying that everybody would agree, but we didn't impose them. We had a lot of conversations about that, and a sufficient amount of organizations said, this is helpful to see all these practices together. It helps us to defend what we're doing. It helps us to kind of articulate and bring under words, give words, explicit words to what we're doing. About the definition of solidarity, I must admit I'm not sure. We had long discussions, never-ending discussions, and I happen to be a sociologist, and I, no matter how much I've worked together with pedagogues and educationalists and geographers and political scientists, although I must admit the educationalists are the most difficult ones to work with, which has nothing to do with the educationalists themselves, but it's a very different way of thinking than with most of the social sciences. But I cannot escape my own discipline. So sharing resources is just how I feel about it. But I must admit, the educationalists were always the most critical ones. And on last Tuesday, we went to the European Solidarity Center, and we had, with Maria, and we had all the students. And the first thing Jacek Koltan, who's our guide, said was, I don't like what sociologists say about solidarity. They always tie it to social integration, to social order. I will show you that's in the practice, in the struggle. And so it's an ongoing debate. So that definition of solidarity, there are other ones which are equally good. The only thing that I feel is that because I have been involved in this continuous research, I feel that there is some overlap there. We don't all mean the same when we say solidarity, but there's sufficient overlap to make the conversation between us interesting enough. If we would be talking about entirely different things, then I think the conversation would be over in seconds because we wouldn't have any interest in each other's answers. The fact that we keep on having ongoing conversation, including with pedagogues who have a much more practice-based and process-based understanding of it, means that at least we are hinting at something similar, I think. But your definition would be an equally good starting point to start reflecting on it, I think. There's not one definition. This is just the one that we settled on because in the end you have to sort of move ahead. I wasn't aware of sharing and dividing having the same etymological roots in Polish. That's really interesting. But is it sharing and redistribution? Because redistribution has also some idea of you divide resources. Yeah. But sharing and redistribution is indeed, it's not the same. It has different...
So this is a story about sharing and division, podzielanie i dzielenie. Podzielać przestrzeń, sharing space. In Polish you can say podzielać przestrzeń, dzielić się. Division is completely... Okay, it's on the margin.
But it's interesting because these etymological roots does mean something. There's some deep thinking there about what solidarity means, but yeah, unfortunately my Polish is very, very limited, so I wouldn't be able to say something meaningful. I mean, and it links to your question, the culture geographer, and your question. We had long discussions about whether solidarity should be linked to having something in common. In the end, we came to the conclusion that it's impossible to think and practice solidarity without some feeling of commonality. We couldn't think outside of that. And some people said, no, you only have to have the law of rule. You have a system that redistributes, that's enough. And we kind of felt in all our research, there was always this search for what do we have in common before solidarity became possible. So we settled on the idea that there needs to be something in common. However, what we felt was that what people have in common can change over time, can change in different circumstances. The way we have learned it in our world of nation states is what we have in common is culture. And we wanted to unsettle that. We wanted to say, no, you don't necessarily have to have culture in common. It would always also be weird because we are not, it's not that we are completely encapsulated into culture. I mean, we're not sort of, we work with culture, we use it, but it's not that we, so we didn't like we said we need to unsettle the idea that you can only be in solidarity with people you share a culture with. But because we felt that you had to have something in common, we were looking for the other thing that people could have in common, something that is more low threshold for urban conditions which change a lot, and that's how we settled on place and practice. Not because place is enough, I completely agree with you, Martin, that place is not enough, but we felt having a place in common or doing something together, doing a practice together is an alternative to having a shared culture, is an alternative to having a sort of being part of the same nation or the same political group. So we felt, starting from practice and place, that this was another starting point to create a form of solidarity that would be easier accommodate for differences. And we found a lot of examples where people who have very little in common still did things together. They were urban farming together, they were engaging in weaving together, they were organizing activities for kids together, and so we felt that starting from place and practice is a good alternative to find something that people have in common, that they share, on which they can build forms of solidarity. But we would still maintain that if in that practicing things together and being in the same place, the roots of solidarity that we sort of identified in sociological canon would still hold. So when people are practicing together, what you very often see is a kind of division of labor. People are doing something together and each of them contributes from something that they, or he or she or them can contribute to something. So there would be some kind of a division of labor, always. Or they would have a sort of shared enemy, so they would do things together because they disliked another group, or they disliked something that was happening to an area. So we felt that in this place and in these practices, the source of solidarity came back, but not in a national framework. So we looked for place and practices as the thing that was shared. So space and practice is not enough. There's something else operating there, but we felt that this was the sort of the commonality on which you can build solidarity. The theory of radical needs, we need to talk about that. That could be a different option, but I don't know the author you're mentioning. So, inequality, it's a good answer. We kind of, the three Enlightenment values are freedom, of liberty, equality, and solidarity. And we insist, or I insist, that solidarity is different from equality. You can have solidarity in radically unequal societies. Empirically. You can impose solidarities, very strictly impose them. People can have feelings of solidarity with people that are radically different from them in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds. People can rally behind their company owner, even if that company owner has a lot more money and a lot more resources and may be exploiting them. That's possible. However, we would say that the best form, the most qualitative form of solidarity are those rooted in equality. We would say that they are more sustainable and that they are of a better quality, that they are to be preferred. But it is possible to have solidarities amongst radically unequal people. It's a different thing. It's not the same as equality. But of course, solidarity may be used to create a more equal world. But nationalist solidarities, and nationalist movements are very effective in creating solidarities. In my country, we have had a very powerful radical right movement since the 1980s, and they're very, very successful and effective in creating solidarities, but they're very unequal. They're very exclusionary, and they create solidarities between people of very different classes, but very effectively. And I find that from an ethical point of view, they are solidarities, even if I don't really like them, I dislike them. I think they have exclusionary effects, but they are solidarities. So I would propose to analytically at least, to distinguish solidarity from equality. They have all kind of complex relationships, but they don't necessarily imply each other. But I would basically say, if we want to create new solidarities, let's create solidarities that are more equal, that lead to more equality. But whether that's the case, that's, I think, an empirical question. I'm sorry for that, that's all we can do. But learning is, and we learned a lot. We had in our previous project, we had Pista, which is one of the educationalists, and he explained to us, or he tried to explain to us, that you have many different types of learning. And of course, that's very interesting. He said, for example, you can learn by being part of a group, you can socialize. And so I had this case of a youth movement, which I didn't explain, but what was very interesting in a youth movement is that people learn solidarity in a youth movement. When children go to a youth movement, they learn solidarity. And they learn this by being part of the group. They come there as young children at the age of 6. And over the years, they're socialized in being in solidarity. And so, I don't know much about Polish society, but in Belgium, youth movement is the most popular part of civil society. People who are in a youth movement have networks for life. And so many of these these youngsters there on the picture, their parents would provide a lot of their free time to move their children to activities, to be volunteers and cook for the children when they go on a camp. So there's lots of solidarity involved there. People, after many decades of not being in the youth movement anymore because they're adults, would still show solidarity to them. So it's a very powerful model of solidarity, but it's a socialization model. You have to fit into the group and you have to learn that. And so what Gerbista also learned is that not every form of solidarity is in terms of socialization. You also have disruptive learning, where solidarity comes because of a disagreement, because you're challenged in your very core of what you are. And you can then shy away, as most people do. You can move away and hence kind of not be in solidarity. But you can be challenged by somebody who really criticizes you to the core of your being and say, hey, I want to listen to that person. I want to hear what this person has to say to me. I want to open up and maybe become someone else because of what that person said to me. And that is solidarity. That's, he called it subjectification, I think. That's a very different form of solidarity. And so what we analyzed in this youth movement was what happens if you do this in Molenbeek. Molenbeek is a very diverse community in Brussels. It has more than 90% people with a migration background. It's notorious for, as a breeding ground for Muslim terrorism, unfortunately. So it was called by Donald Trump the hellhole of Brussels. So it's a very tough environment to live in. It's a very diverse environment, lots of conflicts. But they set up a youth movement there, and they were asking the question, one of the youth movements, if we can set up a youth movement here, can we have the kids redefining what the youth movement is about, given that the people who live here don't have this tradition of being in a youth movement, come from very different environments. Can they, if we facilitate it, can they engage in a discussion with us and tell us what a youth movement would be like if you would do it in this very multicultural, very disadvantaged community of Brussels? And they were able to do so. So they redefined what the youth movement was about. The most difficult thing, and that's where subjective learning is very different, it's very difficult, is that when they started this, the people from the youth movement thought the debates that we're going to have are going to be about halal food, about the plays that we do that maybe are too, there's a lot of Muslim population in the area. It's going to be about alcohol consumption in the youth movement. It's going to be about children's plays who are too bodily touchy, which, you know. In fact, they discovered that these were issues that the kids wanted to discuss. But the most important disagreement was that some of these youngsters who came out of this neighborhood said, the kids that we deal with here are not your average Flemish middle-class kids. Many of them have migrated to Europe, have been traumatized by that move. And they traveled to the Middle East in a boat. They have been in war zone areas. And so you can't expect volunteers to look after these children. The job is just too heavy. This is almost professional social work. And so they asked from the youth movement and said, if you want us to organize a chapter of our youth movement in this neighborhood, we should involve professionals, at least one professional, because we have to work with traumatized kids, with kids in very poor circumstances, with kids that have domestic violence at home, that have all kinds of problems. And the youth movement said no. The tradition of youth movements in Belgium is children, older children, organizing activities for younger children, no adults involved. That's the tradition of the youth movement. You have youngsters organizing activities for kids, and it's volunteer work. And we don't have any adults because this is our place, which, I mean, is a great emancipatory idea. It's a youth movement. But because of that tradition, they were unable to open up for these kids who said, well, you know, some of these kids are just, you know, have too many social problems. We can't just do, you know, youth work as if these children are just all from a middle-class family without social problems. We need professional social workers, and they were unable to open up. So they couldn't show solidarity with that demand. And the end result is that in Belgium we have youth welfare work and we have youth work. Youth work is mostly for white kids, middle-class kids, organizing their own activities, and youth welfare work is the same work but organized by professionals, welfare workers, social workers. And that's because of the lack of solidarity. Because they can't rethink their model beyond the idea that this is volunteer work. Because it's so ingrained that people, out of a sort of emotional response, said, no, no adults, no professionals, this is our movement. And that's a lack of solidarity. So that was a moment of subjectification which did not produce the right type of solidarity, I think. Anyway, it was a very long-winded answer too.
Thank you so much. It's time to say goodbye, but not such a goodbye that we will not stay in touch with Steen Osterling. So I declare that I can pass your emails to our guest professor, visiting professor. So if you like to exchange your thoughts, if you like to make contact alive, please write an email to me, maria.mendel@ug.edu.pl. I will pass them all to Steen. Thank you for your participation. Thanks a lot, Steen, once again, never-endingly. Chapeau bas. Thank you very much again and again.